welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, then hi, my name is Jenna and I'm back with another True Crime Tuesday video. I don't know what this was. Today's case is about the last woman that was hanged in the UK. Before we get started, I would just like to say, if you are not already, then please hit that subscribe button and join my little community here on YouTube. And if you like the video, please give it a thumbs up because it really does help me out. Also, I just want to give my usual disclaimer now that I do not mean any offence to anybody that I mention in this video. I'm just compiling information that I have found from various sources and putting it into one video. Right, let's get started. So the woman that we are talking about today is named Ruth Ellis, and this case actually really frustrated me when I was looking into it because there seems to be conflicting opinions when it comes to Ruth as a person. And depending on what you read or what documentaries you watch, you're going to form different opinions on Ruth as a person. And she was no perfect citizen by any means, like she definitely wasn't perfect, but she wasn't a monster. So one documentary that I watched, which I believe was by the BBC in the 90s, went into great detail about things like Ruth's childhood and her general upbringing. And it also had interviews with people that were just involved in Ruth's life, so people that were there when all of this happened. So it had her sister in the interviews, it had lawyers, politicians, friends, it had people that knew Ruth and knew the situation and were there at the time. Then I watched another documentary, and I think it was ITV, I'm not quite sure, but it had Fred Dinage in it, which I'll put a picture here. You'll all probably recognise him if you're from the UK. And it was shocking how different the two were. The one for ITV didn't mention anything about any of the hardships that Ruth faced in her life, in her childhood and her later years. And these things that happened in her life would ultimately be a factor in her committing murder. So I don't know why they didn't mention it. It just made her out to be the villain and a bit of a slut, to be honest. So yeah, it just really annoyed me that they could be so different. And if you watch the ITV documentary, you'd know nothing about her life and you would form the opinion that, yeah, she deserved what she got. So after doing more research about Ruth, I found that the BBC documentary is pretty accurate, so I'm going to kind of go off of that and go off of the other research that I did about her. I will also link the documentary down below in the description if anyone's interested in learning about her further. So Ruth was born on the 6th of October 1929 and she was born in North Wales. Her mother's name was Bertha and she was said to be just a really, really deeply religious woman, but also very depressive. Her father was Arthur Nielsen and he was a musician. This was kind of the era where the type of music that Arthur played, like dance hall music, was kind of fading out and giving way to the new generation of music. So he really struggled to get work. So they often moved around and they didn't have a lot of money growing up either. The family, which consisted of the parents, Ruth, her 2 brothers and 3 sisters, they moved to Basingstoke and then after a couple of years they settled in South London in 1941. Now unfortunately Ruth's father was a very angry man and liked to take out his frustrations on his daughters. In an interview, one of Ruth's sisters, Muriel, said how her father started abusing her when she was just 10 years old. At the age of 14, Muriel fell pregnant by her father. And when her mother found out, she was kind of confused because she thought, well, who could the father be? Because I don't let my kids out very often. So she asked Muriel who the father was, and Muriel told her it's Daddy's. And she said everything that had been going on for the past few years to her mother, but she didn't believe her. Sadly, because her mother didn't believe her, she failed to protect Muriel and also failed to protect Ruth. When Ruth was still quite young, she went to Muriel and told her that their dad had been touching her and abusing her, and she confided in Muriel because she was too scared to go to her mother. The abuse that Ruth and her sisters endured wasn't just sexual abuse, it was also physical abuse, and he used to give them beatings on a regular basis. In 1944, Ruth was 17, and this was, well, it's still during the war, but this was the time that all the youngsters were going out to like the dance places. They were dancing, having a good time. They were meeting all sorts of people because, of course, the American and Canadian officers would come over and they would dance with them and stuff. And this is where Ruth met a man named Claire, and he was a Canadian officer. She fell completely head over heels for him, and he swept her off her feet. He said that he wanted to marry her. He constantly showered her in gifts, said he loved her, would take her to the nicest places in town. And eventually Ruth fell pregnant with Claire's child and gave birth to a son who she named Claire Andre Nielsen. When Claire Sr. got back, and it is a man's name, by the way, it is a man's name. So when he got back to Canada, he sent letters to Ruth and flowers and said that he wants to marry her still and he will be back soon, but he never came back. This was when Claire's mother decided to take matters into her own hands because, you know, she wanted to know whether this guy was actually coming back for her daughter. So she decided to contact someone that she knew in Canada that had like military ties, and she wanted to find out a bit more about this Claire man. And when she dug a little deeper, she found out that he was actually married with children. Unfortunately, this kind of thing happened so much during the war. The American and Canadian soldiers would come over, they would fool around essentially with young girls, or young women, that sounded bad, with young girls, and when it was all done, they would go back and they'd go back to their wives and children. Ruth was absolutely heartbroken by this, and she left with her boy Andre, her newborn son, left home, and she had to go and find a job. She had various different jobs. She worked in a factory with her sister Muriel, but none of these really lasted very long because she just wanted more for herself. She got herself a job in a place called the Camera Club. This was a place with a bit of a dodgy reputation, so it was kind of like a normal, It's kind of like a normal bar lounge type place, but with a difference. So it would let groups of men or just individuals to take glamour photos of the women that worked there. And of course the club said no to pornography, but it didn't stop the clients and the women who worked there from coming to their own arrangements, so nude photos were definitely taken there. This was something that came naturally to Ruth though, and was kind of like a stepping stone into the kind of work that she would go on to do. So whilst working at the Camera Club, Ruth met a man named Maurice Conley, and Maurice was the manager of a place called the Court Club in Duke Street, still in London. He recruited Ruth to be a nightclub hostess. Now, it's not as innocent as it sounds, really. So she would do the normal hostess jobs, like greeting people, showing them to tables, etc. But she was also basically a prostitute for the place. She would kind of brush it off and say that it's perks of the job, and she would only sleep with people if she actually fancied them. She wasn't really that bothered, and it just, again, it came naturally to her. Ruth soon became pregnant whilst working at the club, and she had a illegal abortion because she just wanted to get back to work as soon as possible. She was, you know, earning a lot more money than she did in the factories and everything, and she came to really like the lifestyle that she had through having this money. Whilst working at the Court Club, Ruth met an older man named George Ellis. He was 41 years old, he was a divorced dentist, and he had 2 sons. You know the saying that some women go for men that remind them of their fathers? Well, this one is quite like that. George Ellis was incredibly jealous and possessive over young Ruth, and he was a violent, heavy drinker, and he was actually an alcoholic. However, the pair still married in November of 1950. In 1951, Ruth fell pregnant with their child, but George refused to believe that he was actually the father of the child, and they ended up divorcing shortly after she gave birth. Ruth gave birth to a daughter named Georgina. I couldn't find out much about Georgina's life after this point, because she's not really mentioned in Ruth's life after this. And from what I could find out, she actually ended up living with her father, George Ellis. According to Ruth's sister Muriel, George used to not just hit her a bit, he used to violently bludgeon her till she could not really move. He was actually treated for his alcoholism at a mental hospital, But somehow Ruth got in her head that he wasn't going to this hospital for treatment, he was going there to have an affair. So one day she rocked up and she made a complete scene, and people came outside and kind of like tried to calm her down, restrain her, and she was actually put on antidepressants because of this, and it's something that she stayed on for the rest of her life. Once Ruth had left George, she went back to her old ways in London with her son Andre. By 1953, Ruth had managed to work her way up in a club called the Little Club to club manager. This role, it was how it sounds. She did manage the place, but part of her job role was still to sleep with the clients. Many celebrities and socialites would visit the club. It was a popular place for people to go, and this is how she met David Blakely. He was friends with like racing car drivers, and there was like a whole crowd of them, and they liked to come into the Little Club, so that's how they met. David was 3 years younger than Ruth. He was good looking, he was charismatic, and also into racing cars, race car driving. But he was also a very heavy drinker. Ruth once asked her sister Muriel what she thought of David, and Muriel said something along the lines of, he's not really your type, and anyone who flirts with other women like that is just a no, and I don't know why you bother with him. Within a matter of weeks though, David had moved into Ruth's flat. They were now living together, even though he was currently engaged to another woman named Mary Dawson. People that knew them would say that the arrangement suited them both equally. Ruth liked the fact that David would come to the bar, he would bring all of his race car driving buddies, and they would obviously spend a lot of money in the bar. They could drink like fish, and it was good publicity for the bar. And David liked the fact that Ruth ran this place and he could go there and he could drink for free anytime he wanted, and of course he was a heavy drinker. Having said all of this, apparently their relationship was a very passionate one. They did argue a lot, but every time they made up it was always with great passion and love. There'd be constant arguments with the couple, and it was mainly through jealousy. So even though they were in this relationship, David would still go after other women, and this obviously made Ruth jealous and upset. And Ruth was still seeing clients in the Little Club, which made David angry. Apparently sometimes he wouldn't even wait till he got home to beat her. He would take her into another room at the bar and he would, just beat her so everyone could hear next door. Ruth would often kick him out, but she would do what unfortunately a lot of people do in abusive relationships. When she would kick him out, he would come back with promises of change and saying he's sorry and he loves her, blah, 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 and she would take him back every time. From the outside, like many people say about these situations, like, just don't let them back. But when someone abuses you mentally, like physically is bad enough, but when it's mentally, they have such a hold on your mind that you do just believe them. Even though Ruth was with David, wow, do I look orange? I think I do. Even though Ruth was with David, she also had a relationship with another man. Like I said before, she wasn't perfect. So whilst David was away at like a racing event thing, she met a man named Desmond Cousins, and she had an affair with him. She carried on seeing Desmond even when David got back from the races, which obviously affected their relationship quite a bit. For Ruth, it was more of like a friendship and a protection type thing, but Desmond was in love with Ruth. He wanted her to be with just him, and yeah, he loved her. Ruth lost her job for some reason at the Little Club, and when she did, Desmond paid for her to go into a new flat. He looked after her son, and he also paid for her son to go to a really good school and paid for his fees and everything. It all sounds like she had it quite good with Desmond, but she couldn't leave David. He just had a hold on her. When David found out about Desmond paying for things, he completely lost it, and the arguments just got worse and worse from here on out. On the 28th of March 1955, yet another row broke out. At this point though, Ruth was 2 months pregnant. The argument started around money, so David said that he couldn't afford to support a baby at this time, and the row escalated and he said that he could never marry Ruth because she was nothing but a common tart. This obviously upset Ruth, so she shouted back at him something like, well, you're no good. And with this, he turned around and he punched her in the stomach. And then he left. He left Ruth lying on the floor, crying and heavily bleeding. David fled to his usual place that he would go to whenever he left Ruth for whatever period of time, which was Carol and Aunt Findlater, their house. Ruth hated this relationship that he had with these people. She thought it was really weird because Carol Findlater and David used to be lovers, so it was really odd that he still went and saw them. After this, just before Easter, David and Ruth went with the Findlaters to another racing event, which again is weird. Whilst at the races, Ruth was still heavily bleeding and she caught a cold, so she had to go home back to London. When she got back to London, David sent her letters and flowers and stuff saying that he loved her forever and blah, 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 all nicey stuff. According to friends of David, they knew that all of this lovey-dovey, I want to be with you forever, I want to marry you stuff was a load of rubbish. One friend of David, when interviewed, said she really thought that they were going to live happily ever after, and we knew that that was never going to happen. David was just using her. So the plan was that when David returned to London, he would spend the Easter holidays with Ruth in her flat. And he was supposed to turn up at her flat and everything, and he didn't show up. This angered Ruth a lot, so she asked Desmond to help her track David down. Of course, David was again at the Findlaters' house, so Ruth turned up there, she caused a scene, and she left. That was it. But she started to think at this point, maybe he's actually left me for good. He's killed my baby and then he's left me. She was left in a state, she was still bleeding from her miscarriage, and she felt so alone, and she had been let down and abused by nearly every key man in her life. She was lost and she turned to Desmond to ask him what she should do. On Easter Sunday night, Ruth walked up to David as he exited one of his usual pubs in London. She called his name and then she shot him multiple times at close range. Witnesses at the scene said that after this happened, Ruth was just stood there in a daze, and apparently that's a characteristic of someone who's very traumatised. When Ruth was arrested, she was arrested by a off-duty police officer that was just at the scene, and he said that he heard her saying something like, "I'm guilty, I'm a little confused." When Ruth was arrested, things just basically got worse and worse from there. She never denied, or tried to get out of what she had done. In fact, she was quite keen for the death penalty because that was the only way she was going to see David again. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, that is literally what Ruth would say and what she really believed. And a lot of people did believe it at the time. It was in the Bible, people more religious, I think, but yeah. The defence team decided to get her examined by a doctor named Dr. Whittaker, or Mr. Whittaker, I don't know which one he was, but this man frustrates me so much. Can you hear the waves? It's like a bloody tsunami out there right now. This man is so frustrating. He literally only spent 2 hours examining her, and afterwards other psychiatrists and psychologists and whatever they're called, they would say that 2 hours is nowhere near enough time to examine someone, and especially if they're going up for murder and their life is at risk. 2 hours is the kind of time you spend with someone who's being convicted for burglary or something, not murder. When in court, Dr. Whittaker also didn't help Ruth by saying that yes, she was emotionally immature, but she was only somewhat deranged and not grossly deranged. And deranged is a word that we don't use anymore, by the way. So when Desmond Cousins was in the witness box, the defence missed the opportunity to ask him what Ruth's mental state was at the time. And of course, this could have really helped. Another mistake they made was organising to get Ruth's hair freshly dyed in prison. And this was a mistake because before they, did her all up, dolled her up, whatever, she looked like the vulnerable, hurt woman that she was. But when you bleach her hair bright blonde and put on a face of makeup, she becomes less relatable, more cold, more stern, more serious, and this went against her in court. So the verdict at the end of the trial was for Ruth to be sentenced to death by hanging. This made a lot of people think whether capital punishment should still be a thing, because they couldn't believe that they were putting to death this young mother. She was only like 28 years old, 27? I think she was 28 years old when she died, which is very young. Ruth's friend, Jackie Dyer, decided to write to George Rogers, who was a Labour MP at the time, and he was an abolitionist for the death penalty. Mr. Rogers visited Ruth in prison to try to get her to change her mind, and it was very difficult, but eventually he said, "What about your son? Who's going to take care of your son?" And this kind of changed Ruth's mind. Well, it partially did, because she kind of flitted from wanting to die in her sentence and then wanting to be spared. She was kind of in between. So Mr. Rogers did everything he could, and then it was left with the Home Secretary, who was Gwilym Lloyd George. Many people, like people that were involved in the case, public, they all thought that she was going to get a reprieve and that her sentence would be changed. So with a reprieve, the Home Secretary is supposed to base his decision on facts, like facts of the case, and politics doesn't come into it at all. Mr. Lloyd George decided not to do that, and his decision really was based on politics. In his statement, he said, "If a reprieve were granted in this case, we should seriously have to consider whether capital punishment should be retained as a penalty." In case you haven't guessed, Mr. Lloyd George was very for the death penalty, and he didn't want it to change anytime soon. One of the assistants under Mr. Lloyd George was a man named Philip Allen, and he said that in this case he did exactly what he would do in any other murder case. He went through Ruth's files and her case and compiled all of the facts and presented a recommendation and passed that on to Mr. Lloyd George. And in this case, his recommendation was to grant a reprieve. Philip Allen really did believe that the Home Secretary would do the right thing and base his decision not on politics. After this was passed on by Philip Allen, a new piece of evidence came about. The evidence was that Desmond Cousin was more involved in this murder than he had let on. He had actually driven Ruth to the murder scene, and he had given her the loaded gun that she used to shoot and kill David Blakely. Ruth's solicitor, John Bickford, was actually told on separate occasions by both Ruth and Desmond this piece of information, and he decided to do nothing with it. After this, Ruth dismissed John Bickford straight away, and she hired her divorce lawyer, Victor Mishcon. Mishcon and his team had just one day to save Ruth. He decided to visit Bickford and ask him if there was anything that he should know that would help him in the case, and Bickford said something like, well, nobody has ever cleared up who gave her the gun, which is like, you know who gave her the gun, why say that? But Mishcon took this as something that he could work with, and he got to work straight away. He went down to the prison where Ruth was so he could ask her some questions on this. And at first, Ruth's answer was, "I have taken a life and therefore my life should be forfeit for it." She would also say things like, "Oh, coming out of prison in years' time looking like an old hag, no thank you," which is funny. Mishcon wasn't ready to give up though, and he finally persuaded her by again mentioning the son and saying, doesn't he deserve to know the truth? With this, Ruth finally decided to tell the story of what happened in the running up to the murder. She said she spent the afternoon and evening drinking with Desmond, and he had given her a loaded gun and driven her to the pub where David was. She said that he supported her the whole way and not once did he try and talk her out of it. Basically, without Desmond, it's very unlikely that she would have committed the murder at all. Mishcon was running out of time at this point, so he rushed to where the Home Secretary usually works, but unfortunately he was at the races, he wasn't there, so he was called to come back immediately because there was no evidence. The evidence of Desmond Cousins being basically an accessory to murder, which would have changed the whole case. The Home Secretary decided that the evidence was a load of rubbish, and the reason why is so annoying. It's because he received a memo from a female prison officer saying that she had overheard Ruth and Mishcon talking and that Ruth's lying, and she said that her idea was the gun and blah 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 blah. The Home Secretary decided to believe the prison officer without even investigating, even though he did say that it was an interesting contradiction, but he didn't look into it any further, just believed her straight away. The police decided to try and find Desmond because if they were going to put him on trial potentially, they had one witness. That one witness was Ruth, and they were about to kill her. Ruth only had 16 hours left to live, and the grand total of hours they took to look for Desmond was 8 hours. 8 hours. Mishcon was absolutely furious with this. He thought they should be spending days, not hours, in this kind of situation to search for someone. Time, though, had unfortunately run out, and Mr. Lloyd George made a statement saying that there would be no temporary or permanent reprieve, and said if she doesn't hang tomorrow, she never will. Unfortunately, the press were never informed of this new information, and Mishcon thought that if they had have known, the public outcry would have been so large that the Home Secretary couldn't have just swept it under the carpet, and she probably would have gotten a reprieve. On the 13th of July 1955, Ruth woke early to write her final thoughts in a letter. After this, Ruth was taken to another room and she was hanged until she was dead. Many people have spoken out about her death afterwards, saying that the whole case was a shambles and that justice lost that day and politics won. Paul Allen, the assistant for Mr. Lloyd George, said that after this case he became a firm abolitionist of the death penalty. He no longer believed in it. He said that at the time they went with the law, and the law was that if you committed murder, you were hanged. That was it. But he decided that maybe the law was now wrong. Unfortunately, this is such a sad bit of the story, but Ruth's family was so greatly affected by this. George Ellis, Ruth's former husband, drank himself into a deep depression, and 3 years after her death, he eventually killed himself, and he hung himself. At this time, their daughter Georgina, who was with George Ellis, was just 6 years old, and she had to be put into care. She later died at age just 50 of cancer. In 1969, Ruth's mother Bertha attempted to commit suicide by gas inhalation, and she failed, and she never fully recovered from this. She could never speak or not really move much ever again. In 1982, Ruth's son, now named Andy, committed suicide in a bedsit. He is said to have never got over what happened to his mother. Ruth Ellis was the last woman in the UK to be hanged. Her death sparked the movement for the abolition of the death penalty, and 10 years later, the death penalty was finally abolished in the UK. So what are your opinions on this case? Do you think she should have got the death penalty? Do you even believe in the death penalty? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Thank you for watching, and again, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like because it will really help me out. And if you aren't already, hit that subscribe button so you can see more from me, and I will see you in my next video.